What if I told you that MSG has been at the center of racist and xenophobic myths, poorly designed studies, and chemophobia? Let's talk about it. Hi folks, today we are talking about monosodium glutamate, or what's also known as MSG, which is probably one of the most controversial flavor enhancers on the market. And it's been widely used for a very long time. For years, the American public has been misinformed by information about monosodium glutamate, or MSG, and we need to talk about it. But before we do, a few housekeeping notes. If you like hearing about weight neutral focused approaches to health, as well as diving into scammy and, in my opinion, unethical nutrition related products, businesses, mostly MLMs, as well as overall fear mongering claims, if you are into that, then please make sure you are subscribed, because that is what we chat about here on this channel. I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist, and I absolutely love dispelling nutrition related myths and stopping any nutrition related fear mongering claims. Next news, I have merch. It's just a couple of stickers and some pouches, some empowered eating reminders, things that we say a lot on this channel. But I also have two of my favorites, like the cookies not cults and the toe beans not pyramid schemes. I will leave a link for those down below in the description box, but for now, let's talk about MSG. So what exactly is MSG? MSG is a seasoning that contains sodium, so like what is found in table salt, with glutamate, and that is an amino acid. Glutamate is the most abundant type of amino acid in the human body. So amino acids, those are individual molecules. When they're linked together, several in a row, that's what forms into proteins. That's what we eat. When we eat proteins, we break those proteins down into smaller chains and further break them down into individual amino acids. And so glutamate is one of the amino acids that we can make on our own. Our body produces glutamate on its own, but we can also get that glutamate from the foods that we eat. Glutamate is naturally found in many different kinds of foods. Examples include cheese, tomatoes, even in green tea, and mushrooms, that's a big source, but green tea, it's found in so many different places. So MSG is the glutamate with the sodium attached to it. When it is combined with water in like your saliva when you're eating it, it breaks down into that sodium and that glutamate. And that's one of the reasons why there isn't so much concern. Well, there is concern over it, but for other reasons. But your body cannot distinguish the difference between that glutamate from food, or glutamate specifically from MSG, versus the glutamate that your body produces on its own. It's the same structure, it's the same amino acid. So whether you get glutamate from your body making it, whether you get some glutamate from green tea, or you get some glutamate from MSG, the body will see it as glutamate. The average glutamate production in the human body is around 50 grams per day, and the average consumption of glutamate from foods is around 13 grams. Now that is from food, not MSG on its own in particular. So when you look at MSG in America and also the United Kingdom, some numbers estimate there's around a 0.55 gram intake, so less than 1 full gram of MSG per day for the whole entire day. And in Asian countries, or countries where they have more MSG acceptance, where they put it more on their food, it's around 1 to 1.5 grams per day of intake of MSG. And so there's a lot less of the glutamate coming from MSG in particular versus the glutamate from foods, or the glutamate that your body produces on its own. So what is so special about glutamate itself? Why is it a flavor enhancer? Glutamate, the amino acid, gives us that fifth core taste. We have sweet, salt, sour, bitter, and umami. Umami translates from Japanese to essence of deliciousness, which is so true when we're talking about MSG. There is that essence of deliciousness in there. I'll put up a couple of pictures of what the structure looks like, but we have glutamate, the amino acid. It gets turned into glutamic acid, which we'll talk about. That free glutamic acid, that taste that's derived from it, that's what we call umami. That's that savoriness. Umami is a taste that is universally enjoyed. It is utilized in cuisines from all around the world. And we not only have taste receptors for umami umami in our tongues, but throughout our digestive system, which is pretty wild when you think about it. The umami receptors help trigger the neurotransmitters that are involved in mediating the satiety response, helping us to feel more satisfied. So there are 3 distinct properties of umami. There is a sensation that spreads across the tongue, there is a taste that lasts longer than the other basic tastes, and a taste that provides a kind of mouth-watering sensation. Now, all of those combined can be really helpful for people who are having difficulties with their appetite. So glutamate is just part of the taste and flavor experience, just as different amino acids can have different flavor profiles. We can see that it's one of the basic tastes, but we can also see how it impacts the whole flavor profile of the food, as well as the other important parts of food acceptability. And we can see other amino acids more involved with flavors that are more sweet or more bitter. So where did MSG come from? In 1908, Japanese scientist Dr. Kikune Ikeda, I looked up the Japanese pronunciation and that's what I could find, so I hope that is correct, and very sorry if I pronounce that incorrectly. This scientist was the first to attribute glutamate to the unique taste that we now know as umami. He noticed a savory taste in seaweed broth that was distinct from the 4 basic tastes of sweet, sour, salty, and bitter, and following his discovery in 1909, MSG was then patented and commercialized. So today MSG is now made through fermentation, starting with corn, kind of similar to how other fermented foods are created, like yogurt. So the first step in MSG production or creation is taking the glucose molecules from the corn, or the sugars. It is then put into a fermentation tank where the microbes can take the glutamate into glutamic acid, make it into glutamic acid. And this is similar to in yogurt how microbes take the lactose and make it into lactic acid through that fermentation. From there, that glutamic acid is then mixed with sodium hydroxide, and that mixture results in MSG and water. It is then filtered and the water is evaporated, leaving the MSG. So that is the way that MSG, through the fermentation, that's how we currently are getting MSG. There are other ways of getting that free glutamate out as well that we see in foods or other kind of food processes. An example of this is long cooking times. So like a broth or a stock that is cooked for several hours, that is going to allow that free glutamate to be there and more of that umami kind of taste. And also in sun-dried foods or drying of foods, long drying of foods, we see this in sun-dried tomatoes, how it has that more savory kind of flavor. That is the free glutamate that we are tasting when we taste the differences between a fresh tomato or a sun-dried tomato. So why did it get a bad rap? How did MSG become this kind of like bad seasoning or this thing to be avoided? Well, that started in 1968. In 1968, there was a letter that was written by a medical doctor. He sent the letter to an editor for a well-known, prestigious medical journal, and it was just an anecdote. It was his experience of what he experienced after eating at a Chinese restaurant. The letter included his account of generalized weakness, palpitations, and numbness in the arms. Now, also in the letter, he described or he noted that there were several ingredients that could have made that response in his body, and that letter spawned this kind of idea that it was the MSG that caused that reaction, that the MSG was associated with the symptoms or the cause of the symptoms, and that spawned on the, quote, Chinese restaurant syndrome, end quote. So as you can kind of imagine, this created a ton of backlash for Chinese families who were living in the United States who had Chinese restaurants. They started to get backlash for MSG and this restaurant syndrome. It stirred up the already racist ideas and xenophobia that people had towards those people. And it just put more fear into the minds of people who didn't understand science. So after this letter came out and people started to be concerned about MSG, there were several studies surrounding it. Now, there were flaws in these studies. Studies after this letter included injecting mice with way more MSG than someone would ever consume. And we know that directly inserting something into the bloodstream is not equivalent to how that person will respond, or that mice will respond, or that mouse will respond to something that they were consuming. And the neurotoxicity that some of the mice were experiencing from the extremely high doses was not something that was seen in other studies. And while glutamate excitotoxicity is a real thing, so much of the science around this isn't really helpful or good when it doesn't mimic what would actually happen in real life from food consumption of it. And over the last several decades, scientists have independently verified that MSG consumption is safe when using validated scientific methods. So more about that question, is it safe? Remember, the human body does not discriminate or see any different glutamate from food versus glutamate from MSG, or what your body creates on its own. And normal food consumption of it does not elevate plasma levels of glutamate. And the acceptable daily intake amount, the number, that is not met in typical consumption of it either. Now, could you have symptoms if you ate large amounts of MSG? Sure. However, there is no such thing as a MSG or a glutamate allergy. If you were allergic to glutamate, you would be allergic to the amino acid that your body creates the most of. Monosodium glutamate itself cannot elicit a kind of immune response for an allergy to it. But remember, and we've spoken about on this channel before, that an allergy is not the same thing as a sensitivity. So could somebody have a food sensitivity towards MSG? Some people identify themselves as being sensitive to MSG. However, reactions have not been consistently demonstrated in double-blind, placebo-controlled human trials. And a review of over 40 studies around studies that were looking at MSG and found some adverse health effects. It was found that those were poor quality and had methodological flaws around the study, and that strong clinical evidence of MSG causing these kind of reactions is not found. Some people may exhibit symptoms if they consume large amounts of MSG, maybe like 3 grams or anything 3 grams and above, especially if they're doing it at one time and if it is just MSG and if you are eating that on an empty stomach. Even hitting that 3-gram amount is more than what people who have a lot of MSG intake would eat or consume in a full day. And remember that MSG consumption in the United States and in the United Kingdom is around 0.55 grams, so less than 1 gram a day. And in countries that consume MSG or use MSG often, they're getting around 1.5 grams per day. So to be concerned about hitting that 3 gram, especially at one time, it would just taste disgusting. The taste would be way too much. Now, what about when you see some kind of recommendations to reduce your intake of MSG containing foods? Now, oftentimes, this is a good example of kind of correlation versus causation. So we know that MSG is something that a lot of food companies will add to their foods to make them taste better. We can get it when we're eating out in restaurants. And so you think about what foods are typically going to be higher in MSG specific, so not glutamate. Other foods can be high in glutamate, but MSG in particular, typically they're going to be in the more highly processed, maybe less nutrient dense foods. And so there's this kind of recommendation to reduce your intake of MSG that are in those kind of foods, but it's not so much the MSG, or it's not the MSG that's in there that might be causing some of the concerns around those highly processed or those foods that have more added sugars or maybe some more inflammatory fats added to them. Yeah, they might have the MSG alongside, but that's kind of focusing on the wrong thing. And remember that a lot of times if somebody is using those foods often, relying on those foods, typically they're going to be people who are living in more food deserts or financial difficulties or both. And so by just saying like reduce your intake of foods that contain MSG, like you're kind of missing the forest for the trees. You're missing the whole picture. And it's like just because there's that correlation doesn't mean that is caused by the MSG. And we don't see that in the research. So we need to stay away from blaming everything on MSG and look at the whole system and recognize that we can use that MSG, and we have seen it being used in other kinds of foods without having those kind of issues. So if you do see that recommendation to reduce your intake of MSG containing foods, it's typically other things in those foods and not the MSG itself. And remember, here on this channel, we're always talking about how those foods can still be incorporated and really learning how to not put foods in that kind of good or bad category. MSG is just another tool that we can use, especially because it has around 1/3 of the amount of sodium that table salt has. And it's especially great because it does promote that kind of satisfaction or that feeling of being satisfied when we're eating our food and enjoyment. So what about umami seasonings that say clearly on the label that it does not contain MSG? So this is kind of tricky because we have these kind of foods that contain glutamate. It might be like a mushroom powder, and then they'll mix that mushroom powder with something, let's say like table salt. And so you have that glutamate and the sodium, they're not together, and so technically it's not MSG, but it really is the same chemicals. It's the same chemicals when you consume it. And remember, the word chemical is not bad. Everything is a chemical. So now that you know more about the history of MSG and how it's not so scary, you might be wondering, how might you use MSG? One of the things that's important to know is that MSG is self-limiting, meaning that up to a certain amount, if we just douse everything in a lot of MSG, it's not going to taste as good and we're not going to want to consume it. And so using it to bring more flavor out, to add more dimension to foods, is how you would, like, the goal of MSG, of using it. Really, a little bit goes a long way. And remember that it is self-limiting, and so it's really hard to overconsume it. It's not going to taste good. About half a teaspoon can really enhance the flavor of about a pound of meat or around 4 or 5 servings of vegetables. So a little goes a long way. You can take pretty much any recipe and swap out half of the salt for MSG. And if you feel like you have a recipe and it's just missing a certain something, it's probably missing MSG or umami. And so adding some MSG can be really helpful for balancing out that recipe and really playing along with the other tastes. So just kind of using it as preferred is an option. And it can be an overall tool for helping us to decrease overall sodium intake if that's something that you are trying to do. All right, so now let's shift into an interview that I had with Chris, a food scientist, recipe developer, and professionally trained chef who immigrated to the United States from China when she was 18 years old. So with all of her background, I thought it would be great to speak with her about her experience around using MSG and also seeing it vilified in the United States. All right, Chris, well, thank you so much for just jumping on this interview with me. A little bit of background for the viewers. We went to A&M together. Woo!
Right. Yeah.
And yeah. And so she had reached out to me whenever I was posting about MSG and just some frustrations around that. And because of her history, we were in the same college at A&M, but she was specifically in food science, which is so interesting. And there were some classes that like overlapped, but a lot of them that didn't.
Right.
And so I just wanted to bring her on and chat a little bit about her frustrations around MSG. So Chris, can you tell us a little bit about who you are, kind of what you do?
Yeah, of course. So I am a food scientist and a recipe developer by trade, and I am also a professionally trained chef. I now work for a award-winning restaurant group in Houston, Texas. My food science work history included being the R&D person, the research and development person for a big cereal snack company. I was also a quality assurance technician for a brewery for a while. We didn't get into breweries.
I remember those.
Yeah, and I also work freelance as a recipe developer for formulation purposes. And as a chef, I worked for a bunch of different restaurants, cuisine-wise, a bunch of different restaurants, Cajun Creole, fine dining, French, steakhouse, your pretty made from scratch taquerias in Houston. So I have a pretty wide range of in the Asian cuisine, Thai and Vietnamese restaurants. Those I also consulted for before. So cuisine wise, I try to have a big spread of things because I just want to know and I want to learn. It's always fun to learn more about food in this industry. So
Mm-hmm. Kind of a side note, do you use the book, The Flavor Bible?
yes, I do. Yeah. My husband and I have that book on our bookshelf. It's like the most tattered book that we have because we use it as a guide to like many any recipe you want to make. You can always refer to that. It's wonderful.
It's one of
Yeah.
my favorites. I haven't utilized it as much as I want, but
Yeah.
I like looking at it sometimes, just getting more ideas and
Right.
everything. Yeah, yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
So that was a side note, but I know we got connected with this specifically talking about MSG. I really wanted to talk to an expert about like your frustrations around MSG and just kind of how you use it, how you have used it. I think the conversation is now turning towards more of looking at the science and the evidence that it's not as harmful as what people thought before. But yeah,
Right,
just kind of
for
diving into
sure.
that.
So the attitude towards MSG, I was born and raised in China. I came to America when I was 18, so like 2 days after I turned 18. So a lot of the general attitude towards MSG was new to me. It was kind of a whiplash, which is interesting compared to a Asian American person growing up in America and experiencing a lot of this external information. I came to America not really considering MSG to be like anything of the, you know, special concern or anything. Even if I was in all my food science classes, it wasn't mentioned until my food chemistry class. And we were talking about, I think it was one of the talk radio shows or Dr. Oz show. I have my opinion of him. And
We don't like
and
him on this
MSG
channel.
and MSG got mentioned. I was already a junior in college. That was the first time I've ever heard of like MSG being like the center of this hot button. And that was literally the first time I've heard of Chinese restaurant syndrome. And of course, I was like the one of the two Asian students in the class at the time. And like my entire class like turned around and looked at me. And I was just like, wait, what was that? What did I miss? What did you guys say about MSG? And
Yikes.
so that was interesting because in that class we were specifically talking about misinformation and chemophobia stuff. That was the height of when food babe just became a thing. uh
Yes.
yeah, like 2013, 2014, it was
Mm-hmm.
really when she really kind of, and I think she went on a Dr. Oz show shortly after. So yeah, my food science student friends and I, like we shared a lot about her stuff on like Facebook and all that. But that was the first time I realized that MSG was a controversial thing. So I started noticing more and more labeling on food packaging of like no MSG labels. When I go to restaurants, there might be like no MSG labels on the menu, and I read their ingredients like soy sauce, Maggi seasoning, fish sauce. Like, huh? Look at
Right.
all these delicious fermented items.
Yeah. That
So
contain
yeah,
glutamate and
that contains glutamate,
yeah.
very rich in glutamate, including, well, we know the tomato paste and Parmesan cheese and all that. So I started reading more into it. Also, because it would in my culture in Asia. I'm from China. MSG is called Wei Jing in Chinese. It literally translates to flavor essence. It's a, almost a direct translation from the Japanese word ajinomoto, which also means like essence of flavor or like flavor essence. So it's that's what we call it. We have it in our kitchen. We use it like black pepper or something as a flavor enhancer. You don't put it in everything that you just think it, but it's used as a flavor enhancer. It's used sparingly, just like salt. Um, so yeah, that was very interesting learning all of these shrouded mystery about MSG, this like three-letter word in America as a as a new immigrant in the food science industry. When I did research and development, we put MSG in snacks, in savory snacks. It's a huge flavor enhancer. We noticed like focus group changes when we do sensory panels and when we do marketing research. Um, and on the culinary side, when I switched to the culinary side of things, it was not talked about in school very often when I was in culinary school, but in the industry, it was used as a flavor enhancer pretty commonly in the kitchen. But I did notice that a lot of my restaurant clients and the restaurants I work for will say like, we don't use MSG in this establishment or something like that. Meanwhile, they're just swinging tamari sauce and Maggi seasoning and all that yummy umaminess all over. Yeah.
When MSG is like the most purest form of umami.
Right. Yeah. Like it's yeah, and it's cheap.
Oh yeah.
It's very cheap. So like I have a $4 box in our test kitchen right now. It's ridiculous. Yeah.
So when you have encountered people, other chefs and in the restaurant industry and their concerns around MSG, is that something that, do you feel like there's a shift going on? If there's any changes in how people perceive that or not?
When I joined the restaurant industry, it was already not really a thing among chefs anymore. Like we know it tastes good and we add it in recipes when it's called for. And a lot of the chefs I talked to, they knew that MSG was misunderstood and all that. But it's a matter of the owners or the marketing team or the people who are in charge of the PR for the restaurant. They are more concerned with this, which makes sense. But it's not like we're going to put contains MSG in the menu descriptors of things everywhere on our menu, right below the menu item. It was just something that's not mentioned, kind of used as a secret ingredient. Chefs are pretty enthusiastic about it. And every culture also has their own MSG. Like in Mexican cuisine and Texas cuisine, like you have your caldo, right?
Yep.
That's
the soup
MSG.
I grew up having that bouillon, and then I remember looking, I think it was also when I was like college age, looking at the ingredients and being like, oh, I've been eating this my entire life and it says it has MSG on it. I'm okay.
Yeah, and the most egregious one I think is accent. It's just MSG.
Yes. Oh yeah.
So, but it has a what do you call it in pharmaceutical industry? A marketing name instead of the clinical name of the chemical, right?
The chemical name.
Yeah. So I dream of the day when we can just put like in parentheses, just like the drug company would do, like monosodium glutamate right underneath the accent.
Yeah. I mean, I think just giving more information, getting over chemophobia, that's a huge issue. And I don't know so much about like other parts of the world, but especially in America, chemophobia. outside of MSG, I'm sure that's something that you see a lot or you dealt with a
Hmm.
lot being in food science.
Yeah. In food science, there's a right now, if it's marketed as no MSG added or low MSG product, I've noticed that they've been adding guanylate and another one isosonate or something like that. I need to fact check myself, but they have a synergetic reaction with MSG, so they're also flavor enhancers. They're not MSG, but they serve as a coexisting flavor enhancer along with MSG. So maybe in the formulation you can dial down the concentration of MSG you put in, which should never exceed will never exceed the amount that people think will cause them bad physical response. In FDA studies, they fed they fed people 3 grams of pure MSG without food, and that caused some headaches, nausea, palpitation, and stuff, which is outrageously more than what a regular person would be ingesting in a normal setting. Also, just like pure powder MSG on an empty stomach sounds horrifying to
Right.
me.
Yeah.
Like, also, like, drink some water. Oh my God, that's so much sodium.
It's just too much. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, even that 3 grams spread out at one time is a lot, but even for the
yeah,
whole day, that's a
yeah,
lot. When I was looking at the numbers, it was talking about maybe like 1.2 to 1.7 grams in some Asian
right,
countries, like on the higher end, but
right.
United States, UK, it's around like 0.55, like less than 1 gram
Yeah,
for the entire day.
yeah. MSG is also it usually exists in pretty salty condiments, right? Like your
Mm-hmm.
anchovies, your soy sauce, your Maggi seasoning and fish sauce. Those are not we don't use that in like bucketfuls and when we're cooking anyway. So the the concentration of what we're actually ingesting in MSG form was was not was not nearly as bad as I think some of the people I talked to have
Mm-hmm.
concern with. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So in China, there's no really concern about MSG that because that was something that you just learned of whenever you moved to the United States, right?
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It's served as a flavor enhancer. We also have like the chicken base. Sometimes we also use that. It's
Hmm.
like Chinese gao. Uh,
Nice.
and mushroom powder was also another one. It's like MSG, but enhanced with mushroom extract or mushroom powders. So those are a lot of we use that a lot in our daily cooking. Not like amount wise, but just frequency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just really frustrating. And I'm sure even more so for you of seeing just the reaction of how the thought process around it has been in the
Right.
United States, and just there are those ties to the racism and xenophobia that we really need to look at, and it's just
Right.
really frustrating.
It's been interesting. You also saw your post about you wanted to talk about MSG. Like literally 2 days, I got my MSG tattoo.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, these recent years has been like rough for the Asian community in America, and I've just it breaks my heart to read the news sometimes about the situations. And this, I think, this was partly just like a tongue-in-cheek thing, like, oh, what is that mysterious chemical on her arm? And also, I was hoping that this could be an icebreaker to be like, let me talk to you about MSG.
I love
What do
that.
you think of it? Not
That
have
is such
like
a statement
I,
piece,
I
statement tattoo.
I
That is
don't know how many
amazing.
people will actually I don't know how many people will actually be interested in it. So far, my close my close bubble social circle have all been chefs. So it's just nothing but love from them. They're like, oh, that's awesome. I'm gonna get one too. Yeah.
That's
So
amazing. It's kind of like taking back the power of MSG.
right, exactly. Just it's a topic that I realized in recent years that's so close to home for me as a food scientist and as somebody who is very passionate about science communication, and as a chef and as a Chinese immigrant. All of these things just it boils down to MSG, I guess.
Yeah.
So oh, I forgot to mention another thing, I think, with MSG. When we, as food scientists and as chefs, when we use MSG, it's not just when we use it in recipe formulation, for example, it's not just on its own used as a seasoning for recipe. Like MSG dissolved in water tastes like nothing. It just tastes like very one-dimensional, kind of salty, kind of umami. But its role as a flavor enhancer is heavily relied upon whatever other flavors you have in a recipe. Like if you use it for a meaty dish, it will enhance that meaty, unctuous umami flavor we're looking for in meat products. If you use it to enhance a cocktail, even for a Bloody Mary, is awesome in there. It plays well with a lot of flavorful ingredients on its own. It doesn't really make a good dish. It needs other flavors and spices and textures and just all of that. I hate to use the word synergy. All of that combination of ingredients in a recipe. Just using MSG by itself to season food is going to be very, very flat. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you're going to use even less of that. Like it's just
right. You literally just a little bit goes such a long way if the dish is already made with good ingredients and you use the correct techniques to extract all the gelatin and the pectin and all the other ingredients from vegetables to proteins in the dish already, and the MSG is just a little bit of like cherry on top situation, pixie dusted over
special ingredient if something feels like it's like missing something,
right? If it's missing something.
Have you tried it with the sweet foods like to counteract?
I don't think so. I think not yet. We did use salt a lot when formulating sweet recipes. Every sweets from the cereal and granola and like also the baked goods, I think we use salt more often than MSG. The sodium is such a good flavor enhancer on its own. Salt is already a good flavor enhancer. You just need adds a little dimension to a product, to a dish. Yeah. Okay. I'll look into it, the MSG used in sweet formulations.
I was just thinking about how, because something like salt kind of cuts, or I don't know the terminology, but just rounds it out really well when you have something or something bitter. And so I was wondering if, because kind of using it in that same way.
Right.
So yeah. Well, thank you so much for just having this conversation. I think it's really valuable and really important to listen to people with your background and experience on the chef side and food scientist side, but also as an immigrant from China, as this was called, the Chinese restaurant syndrome, and unpacking that.
It was weird. It was but it's a hill I am willing to die on.
I love that. And I love the tattoo so much.
Thank you.
If somebody does want to follow your work, where can they find you?
I am only on Instagram. My handle is needs.more.salt. Because that's also another thing that in the kitchen we say the most. Salt is a good flavor enhancer as well. If
Mm-hmm.
just salt wouldn't cut it, we'll use a little bit of MSG. So
I love
ain't
it.
nothing wrong about that. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. So, all in all, just kind of like how I mentioned with pretty much any kind of food, if you like it and you want to use it, go ahead. I want you to have the background and to know what you are consuming. If you don't want to have it, then that's okay too. So that wraps up everything. If you like this video or if you have any more questions about MSG, leave them in the comments. I'll try to get to them. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and remember to subscribe if you would like. And that's it. Check out the merch store. All right, I will see you next time. And remember, you can strive for health without subscribing to diet culture. Okay, I'll see you later. Bye.